Welcome to this week's sermon from Spark. We are a community who believes we are deeply loved by God and seek to welcome, support, love, and serve every person we meet. We hope this message has something for you today.
Have you ever done something or said something and you're like barely finished saying it or doing it and you already regret the fact that you did it? Anybody? Like wish you could just like suck the words right back into your mouth, or just like, I don't know if y'all know what rewinding is, but like go back in time and just kind of replay that moment a different way. Yeah, we've all probably been there, right? Because we're all human beings and we all make mistakes. And when we all experience that, and maybe some of the older folks in the room, maybe some of the younger folks in the room too, but older folks, including myself, can also think of times in your life where you like maybe didn't feel that way right after you did something, but like now you think back to who you were when you were a teenager or as a kid, and you're like, you have a memory and you're like, ooh, that was a bad look. I shouldn't have done that. Or, ooh, I really wish I had maybe said something different in that moment. I was reading a book recently. It was written by the same person who wrote like A Fault in Our Stars, John Green, if you're familiar with that book. Yeah, so he has a new book out that's nonfiction, and I was listening to it in my car, and he was talking about this experience of like when you go down, then lay down for bed at night, and all of a sudden it's kind of like your brain is like, I know what we should do. Like, let's put on our favorite Netflix show and like replay all of the parts of your life that you feel most embarrassed by or wish that you could do differently. Like this show of regrets. And I don't know if any other person in this room has had that experience, but I know I have, and I was laughing as I was hearing John Green talk about it, like all of a sudden your brain just decides that this is the thing that you should think about before you fall asleep, and you start replaying all of these memories from long ago that are on this kind of embarrassment loop, or this loop of regret, or this loop of I wish I'd done that differently, and oh my gosh, I'm a terrible person loop. When we have those feelings, that's guilt, right? You know what guilt is? What does guilt feel like? I know I feel guilt in my body a lot. What does guilt feel like to you? Sadness. You know you did something wrong.
Heartbreak sometimes.
Yeah, it hurts your heart. You're hard on yourself. You kind of like beat yourself up maybe mentally about it. Embarrassment. Grief, is that what I heard? Yeah, grief. For me, it's like somebody immediately dropped like a boulder into my stomach, and I'm like, oh no, what am I gonna do with that? Yeah, that like, or you start to get kind of like shaky. You just feel like anxious, right? Yeah.
It's one of those moments when like they ask you how you are, and you say like you're fine, but you're not really fine, and you don't want to get into it.
Yeah, so maybe if you're feeling guilty, somebody asks you how you are, and you're like, I'm fine, but I'm not, internally you're screaming and not really fine. So we all experience this feeling of guilt. And today we've been going through this sermon series where we've been talking about forgiveness. And so today we're going to talk about what it means for us to forgive ourselves. And if I am honest in my own life, that maybe forgiving myself has been the hardest thing to do when I make mistakes, whether they're little mistakes or big mistakes. I can be really hard on myself. I might receive forgiveness from the person who I maybe said a silly thing or a dumb thing to them, and they were like, and I apologize, and I say, I really shouldn't have said that, and they're like, I forgive you. It really didn't affect me that much, but thank you for acknowledging that. And then I still, for like 3 days later, I'm like, I cannot believe I said that. Why did I say that? And you're just like, oh, I'm a terrible person, right? And that you think that's the thing about when we forgive ourselves is so often we're the ones that are still holding on to something that everyone else around us has already moved on and said, yeah, it happened. Yeah, it probably wasn't okay, but we can move past it, right? And we kind of just replay that failure loop in our heads over and over and over again. And so we talked about guilt, right? And guilt, if we were to define it, kind of is this idea of I made a mistake. I did something I shouldn't have done. But there's this other feeling and way of being that sometimes sneaks in when we think about moments where we've messed up, and that's shame. Have you ever heard that word shame before? Yeah. And guilt and shame, sometimes we try to use them interchangeably, but they're really two different things. And it's okay to feel guilty. So sometimes that's healthy, right? That's our body's signal or our mind's signal to like, I need to change my behavior. I need to go and make amends with that person. It's a signal to us that something's not quite right. Shame is not something that we're intended to feel, right? It's not as much of a healthy or helpful thing. Because while guilt says, I made a mistake, shame says, I am a mistake. Do you hear the difference there? You know? And so it's not like, oh, I did something I shouldn't have done. It's like, I'm a bad person. I'm a terrible person. I am not capable of being forgiven. I'm just bad. I can't ever get it right. I'm terrible, horrible, no good. And I think a lot of us allow our guilt to kind of settle into a place of shame sometimes, especially if the mistakes that we make are big ones. If it's like a big thing that really maybe hurt somebody else or had some bigger consequences, we're like, well, now I'm a terrible person and I can never recover from this. And I want you to hear this morning that God calls us good at the very beginning. God says, I made human beings good and in my image. And even when we are at our worst, there is still a piece of us that is part of the image of God. There's still a piece of us that is made of God. And so there's nothing that we can do to mess up that part of us that is of God. And so we are never completely and totally worthless and gone and lost and too far and bad. Okay? I want you to hear that this morning. But it's hard when you're in these moments to not allow yourself to get caught up into that shame spiral. And so if we're thinking about forgiving ourselves, one of the first questions we've got to ask is, what am I actually responsible for? If I think about something that happened, something I said, something I did, what am I responsible for? How many of you have heard adults in your life say, you need to take responsibility for your actions? Yeah, a lot of us. Because we do, right? There are things that we are responsible for. But sometimes when we are in a situation where we've done something, not every part of it is our fault. Or we take the blame on ourselves or beat ourselves up over something that we didn't have any control over. This happens a lot, especially when you're a kid, because you have a lot of adults in your life that are making decisions for you. And so sometimes you blame yourself for the decision that the grown-up made. Last week we talked about which two brothers? What were their names? Yes. Jacob and Esau, right? And which one of the brothers made more of the mistakes, I will say, in the story? Yes. Jacob. So Jacob's the one who they're twins, but Jacob is, a few minutes younger than his brother, so he gets called the younger brother. And the older brother gets all of the things. In biblical times, they would have inherited all of the stuff and all the responsibility and become like the new leader of the family. And Jacob was jealous of that with his brother Esau. And so he deceived his brother out of his birthright. Do you remember how he did that? Like his brother came home after hunting for a long day and he was really what? Hungry, right? And he came in, he's like, I'm really hungry. And Jacob's just in there stirring a big old pot of your favorite kind of soup. And he's just like, yep, brother, I hear that you're hungry. And Esau's like, can I have some of that soup? And Jacob's like, nope. And he says, only if you give me your birthright. So in that situation, Jacob is responsible for all that happened, right? Because he's the one standing there with the pot of soup. And he's the one that's like, I'm going to take this from you because take advantage of the fact that you're hangry right now. And I'm going to not let you have this bowl of soup until I get your birthright. But then later, Jacob takes something else from his brother. Do you remember what he takes? It's another B word. The father's blessing, right. So Jacob steals the blessing, but in that situation, something else is going on, right? Because when Isaac, Jacob's dad, tells Esau that he is going to bless him, Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mom, is the one that overhears it and goes to Jacob and says, hey, so this is what we're going to do, right? And Jacob follows along with the plan, right? So Jacob does have some responsibility there, but you see that it's really his mom's idea. And all of us know that there's different kind of power dynamics at work when we think about how we interact with our parents, right? We are taught that we're supposed to obey our parents, that we shouldn't disobey them, that we need to do what they tell us to do. So in that situation, yes, Jacob did what he was told, but he was told to do something. And he was told by someone who should have known better as the adult in that situation, right? So for us, when we think back on our lives and we feel that maybe rock in your stomach or that loop of that favorite Netflix show that's not your favorite Netflix show, but it's really all of the things in your life you would rather not remember. When we're in those places, it's important to push pause and say, okay, which of these things are really my responsibility? Okay, some of them, yes, I take responsibility for. I need to have asked for forgiveness or handle them in some different way. But maybe some of them are things that we're beating ourselves up for that really aren't our responsibility, right? So we're going to keep going through this story of Jacob. And I wonder, after all these things that Jacob did, if he ever felt any kind of regret or guilt or shame about what he did, you know? Because we ended the story last week after he had stolen the blessing, and his brother found out about it, and his brother was really mad about it, and his brother threatened to kill him, and so his parents helped him to run away. And that's where we kind of ended last week, but this week we're going to pick up the story and keep going with it. And like I said last week, this story is most often told from Jacob's perspective, so we're going to think about Jacob today. Because Jacob goes away, and he ends up going to his uncle's house, and he stays there for a long time, and a bunch of stuff happens, and I encourage you to read your Bible this week and read about all of that. But we're going to kind of fast forward to a particular moment. But about 20 years have gone by since Jacob has run away from home. And in that time, he's gotten married, and he has lots of kids, and he has worked for his uncle, and he is actually a very good shepherd, and it comes time where God tells him, okay, it's time to go back to the land of your people. And Jacob comes to realize that by going back to the land of his people, who does that mean he's going to see again? Esau, right. After 20 years, he's going to see his brother again, the person who he stole his birthright and his blessing and who threatened. The last time he heard from him, it was a threat to kill him. And so he's got to go back there. And God is saying, okay, it's time to go back home. And so this is what happens next when Jacob is on his way back home, and he is fully expecting to meet Esau. He's actually very afraid because he sends servants ahead to go meet Esau, and the servants come back and say, okay, your brother is coming. And so that night, Jacob on his journey, he lays down and he goes to sleep, and here's what happens. Jacob got up during the night, took his wives, his women servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River's shallow water. He took them and everything that belonged to him, and he helped them across the river. But Jacob stayed apart by himself, and a man wrestled with him until dawn broke. When the man saw that he couldn't defeat Jacob, he grabbed Jacob's thigh and tore a muscle in Jacob's thigh as he wrestled with him. The man said, let me go because dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I won't let you go until you bless me. The man said to Jacob, what's your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, your name won't be Jacob any longer, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with people and overcome. Jacob also asked and said, tell me your name. But the man said, why do you ask for my name? And he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel because I have seen God face to face and my life has been saved. The sun rose as Jacob passed Peniel, limping because of his thigh. So Jacob goes to bed, and all of a sudden, there's someone who's like grabbing him, right? And you think, before he went to bed, Jacob is worried about the fact that he's about to meet his brother. So who do you think he thought this person was? Esau, right? He's like, Esau has found me. This is bad. So they start wrestling, and there's like this fight that's happening. And you imagine if you're fighting someone in the dark and you don't really know who they are, just kind of like wildly thrashing around. You might have accidentally poke each other in the eye and like hit each other. But Jacob wrestles with this person for seemingly hours. Like this is a long time that he's wrestling with this person. And at some point, Jacob had to finally kind of come to the understanding of who it was that he was wrestling with, and that it wasn't actually his brother. Because then Jacob makes this request. He requests a blessing. But Jacob's stubbornness of like wrestling with this person for hours and hours, that's like exhausting, right? And for us, when we hear this story, if we place ourselves in Jacob's shoes and we think about this idea of having to forgive ourselves, sometimes we're in this wrestling match with ourselves for a long time. We don't let it go. We don't forgive ourselves. We don't give ourselves grace. We just continue to think those thoughts that are negative about ourselves, or just replay the moments in our minds over and over and over and over again, and we just can't let up. It's kind of what the type of energy that Jacob was bringing into this wrestling match with God. And he asks for God to bless him. But God already, like, at this point, hours have happened and daylight's starting to maybe kind of creep up. Like, we know that the day is coming. And God is trying to get out of this wrestling match and ends up wounding Jacob in the process, right? Which we sometimes do that too when we're wrestling with ourselves and we're constantly on that feedback loop in our minds, or we have that rock we carry around our stomach, is we're not doing ourselves any good by doing that. We're just kind of sitting in this unhelpful place. And so God wounds Jacob, hopefully so that he'll let go, but he still doesn't let go. In the same way that we continue sometimes to wound ourselves and we just don't let up. And Jacob demands this blessing. Bless me. And you wonder why Jacob might be demanding this blessing. Because the blessing that he'd already received was not for him. Remember? He'd been blessed already, but that blessing was not intended for him. His father had given him a blessing, and yes, that's great and nice and good, but his father did that thinking that he was Esau, not Jacob. And so he's never received that blessing. And I think as we read the story of Jacob, what Jacob is struggling with is his own identity of who am I? Because from the very beginning, he's attached to his brother. He comes out of the womb, and his name is literally, Jacob means take by the heel, because he was holding onto his brother's foot when he was born. So his identity from the very beginning has been attached to his brother. And then his actions further kind of created that attachment of all these negative things that happened between him and his brother. And Jacob just wanted to be free from all of that, from not having a dad that really favored him. He favored his older brother, of always being not the stronger one, of being the one that wasn't going to receive the blessing. But then God does all these crazy things and gives him this blessing, but he knows that it's not really his. And so he's like, God, I want this blessing for me, for who I am. I think Jacob finally had to come to the realization of who he was and acknowledge that, yeah, he had done some things that he shouldn't have done. And all of that was in pursuit of trying to figure out who he was on his own. So he demands this blessing from God. And my favorite part of this whole story is that God's response, we don't hear this blessing of yes, blessed are you, Jacob, for you will have blah, 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 blah. We don't get the full blessing there. What we do get is God says, what is your name? What is your name? And Jacob replies, Jacob. And in that moment, I don't know if Jacob realized it, but that is the moment where he receives that redemption, maybe that he had been waiting for, struggling for, hoping for, praying for, unwilling to give himself. God offers that to him because 20-something years ago, the last person that asked him that question, what is your name, how did he respond? He said, my name is Esau. And he lied. And he pretended to be someone he wasn't. And so here, God is giving him an opportunity to answer the question again. Who are you? And this time, Jacob responds with honesty. I'm Jacob. This is me. And then God gives him a new name. He says, now you can be called Israel, which instead of meaning Jacob of like clinging to your brother's heel, now you are known as someone who struggled with God and overcame. And ultimately, when we struggle with God, that's some of our own internal struggle of who am I? Who have you created me to be? What are you wanting for my life, God? And that's what our journey is like when we are forgiving ourselves. It's like this internal struggle of accepting who we are, including the not so great parts, and including the great parts. Accepting that, embracing it, loving it, having compassion for who we were when we made a mistake. Because sometimes the actions that we take in the moment, it's very much an in-the-moment thing. It's who we are, it's what we were experiencing, it's the circumstances around us, and that is what we did in that moment. But that was that moment. It's not our life. That's not every other time after that, right? But we get fixated on who I was in that moment is all that I can be. Or they think that that's what defines us. And God says, no, there's so much more. And so Jacob gets this new name of Israel. You have struggled with God and you have overcome. And he wakes up the next morning or gets up the next morning. I don't know if he actually got to sleep that night. And it says that he walked away with a limp. He was kind of wounded from that experience. But at the same time, he walked into this conversation he was going to have with his brother better prepared than he ever would have had he not wrestled with God, had he not wrestled with who he was, had he not come face to face with his past, had he not come face to face with whatever was bothering him up until this moment. Because he realized if I can wrestle with God and I can overcome, then I can surely meet my brother and face whatever is about to happen here. You know, friends, when we need forgiveness for ourselves, most often it's because we need to have that conversation with God and to be able to see ourselves the way that God sees us. We've forgotten that there's that little piece of us that is part God. And we've forgotten that no matter what, that piece doesn't go away. And that our value is still found in that piece. And that if the God of the universe offers us love and forgiveness and sees us as beautiful, wonderful creations, then we too can claim that as our truth. Can say, I am good, even in the middle of something that I did that maybe wasn't super good. Because remember, it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to feel guilty. It's okay to do the work, to have to, like we talked about with forgiveness, of taking accountability, reevaluating our boundaries, working through all of that. That's all an okay process. But it's not okay to say that I'm a mistake, that I'm bad, that nothing good could ever come of my life because of this thing that happened. See yourself the way that God sees you. Know that you are made good and holy and beloved, and that there is redemption, that there is no mistake that is not beyond redeeming. And even if it leaves you with a limp, that limp will remind you of what you've overcome and who God is making you into as you continue on your journey. So let's pray together. God, we come to you this morning and we recognize that we are like Jacob sometimes. God, we hurt the people around us, we hurt ourselves. And sometimes, God, it's so hard to let go. We allow that feedback loop, that negativity to continue to whisper into our hearts and to our minds, instead of hearing and searching for your voice.
Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about our ministry, follow the link in the description below. Peace be with you.